Every American child learns the same story. In the 1760s, the British Parliament began imposing taxes on the American colonies. The colonists cried out, "No taxation without representation." The British refused to listen. And so, a brave band of patriots rose up, threw off the yoke of tyranny, and declared independence. It is one of the most famous stories in human history. It is the founding myth of the most powerful nation on earth, and it is, at best, a half-truth. The American Revolution was not caused by oppressive taxes. The colonists were not being crushed by British tyranny. In fact, they were among the least taxed people in the entire British Empire. A typical American colonist paid roughly 1/20th of what an average Englishman in Britain paid. The Stamp Act of 1765 was designed to raise around £60,000, a modest sum, even by 18th century standards. The Townshend Acts generated barely more, and here is the contradiction that historians have struggled with for generations. If the taxes were so light, if the colonists enjoyed more freedom, greater prosperity, and more self-government than almost any people on earth, why did they rebel? Why would hundreds of thousands of ordinary colonists risk their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to break away from the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? To understand the revolution, we must first understand what the colonists actually had to lose. By 1763, the American colonies were the wealthiest and most dynamic part of the British Empire. They had their own elected legislatures. They controlled their own local governments. They paid almost nothing in taxes to London. They enjoyed the full protection of the British Navy, the most powerful military force on the oceans. And they had just witnessed the defeat of their greatest enemy, the French. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, had ended in a stunning British victory. France was expelled from North America. Britain now controlled Canada, the Great Lakes, Florida, and all the territory east of the Mississippi River. The American colonists were ecstatic. They celebrated their British identity. They drank to the health of King George III. They believed they were living in the most fortunate age in human history. And then, something went terribly wrong. Instead of embracing the colonies as partners in victory, the British government began to tighten its grip. New taxes, new regulations, new troops stationed in American cities, and a proclamation that forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, the very territory they had just fought to win. The colonists were not just confused, they were furious. But here is where the standard narrative begins to crumble. The colonists did not object to taxation in principle. They had been paying local taxes to their own legislatures for generations. They understood that governments needed revenue. What they objected to was Parliament's assumption of power, the idea that a legislature in London, thousands of miles away, could impose taxes on them without their consent. And yet, even that explanation does not fully capture what happened, because the British government was not trying to oppress the colonists. It was trying to solve a problem, a massive, terrifying, existential problem. The 7 Years' War had cost Britain an enormous amount of money. By the time the war ended, the British national debt had nearly doubled. It stood at £133 million, a sum so vast that it was almost impossible for the government to repay. Interest alone consumed more than half of all tax revenue. Britain had also acquired an enormous new empire to defend: the American frontier, the Canadian territories, Florida, and the Caribbean islands, all required soldiers, ships, and fortifications. The British government decided that the Americans, who had benefited so greatly from the war, should contribute to the cost of their own defense. It seemed perfectly reasonable to London. It seemed like an act of tyranny to the colonies. And so, we arrive at the central question. If the taxes were modest, if the British government had genuine financial reasons for imposing them, if the colonists were already among the wealthiest and freest people in the world, then why did the revolution happen? Why did a simple dispute over revenue spiral into the most significant political upheaval of the 18th century? The answer is not what you think. It is not one single cause. It is a web of political miscalculations, constitutional crises, economic pressures, and imperial ambitions. all colliding at the worst possible moment. The true origin of the American Revolution is not about taxes. It is about power. It is about debt. It is about a struggle between two fundamentally different visions of empire. And it was not inevitable until the very end. This is the story of how the British Empire lost its most valuable colonies. It is a story of the desperate choices, political arrogance, and hidden ambitions that drove America toward revolution. It is a story that historians have debated for centuries. By the time this documentary ends, you will understand what really caused the American Revolution and why the answer has been hiding in plain sight all along. To understand why Britain imposed taxes on its American colonies, we must first understand the condition of the British Empire in 1763. It was a victory without precedent. Britain had defeated France, its greatest European rival, and had emerged as the dominant power in North America, India, and the Atlantic. But victory came at a terrible price. The British government was drowning in debt, the national treasury was empty, and the empire had grown so vast that it was nearly impossible to govern. The 7 Years' War, which had raged from 1756 to 1763, was the first truly global conflict. Battles were fought in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Britain had financed an enormous military effort across multiple continents. It had subsidized its allies in Europe. It had built the largest navy the world had ever seen. And when the war ended, the bills came due. The British national debt had risen from £72 million to £133 million, an increase of nearly 85%. Interest payments on this debt consumed more than half of all government revenue. The British taxpayer was already staggering under the heaviest tax burden in the world. There was no appetite in London for more taxes on the British people, and yet the empire still needed money. British troops remained stationed in North America to defend the newly conquered territories. The American frontier, stretching from the Great Lakes to Florida, required garrisons, forts, and supplies. The British government estimated that maintaining this military presence would cost approximately £300,000 per year. This was a sum that Parliament was unwilling to raise from British taxpayers. The logical solution, from London's perspective, was to ask the American colonists to contribute. But here is where the story becomes more complicated than simple arithmetic. In 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This decree established a boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains. All land west of this line was reserved for Native American tribes. Colonial settlers were forbidden from crossing into this territory. The proclamation also created 4 new British colonies in North America: Quebec, East Florida, West Florida, and Grenada. These new colonies were to be governed directly from London, without elected assemblies. The proclamation enraged the colonists. They had fought the French and Indian War precisely to gain access to Western lands. Many colonial elites, including George Washington himself, had invested heavily in land speculation beyond the Appalachians. They had purchased vast tracts of land from Native American tribes. They had surveyed the territory and made plans for settlement. The Proclamation of 1763 threatened to destroy their investments and block their dreams of wealth. But the proclamation was not an act of tyranny. It was a desperate attempt to prevent conflict with Native American tribes. The British had learned from experience. Pontiac's War, a massive uprising of Native American tribes in 1763, had demonstrated that the western frontier was dangerously unstable. British officials knew that uncontrolled colonial expansion would lead to endless warfare. They hoped that a strict boundary would preserve peace and save the empire money. What they did not anticipate was the fury this decision would unleash among the colonists. The proclamation was not just a land policy. It was a symbol of London's determination to control the colonies. It was proof that the British government saw the colonists as subjects to be governed, not partners to be consulted. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law was designed to raise revenue by placing duties on molasses and other goods imported into the colonies. It also strengthened enforcement of the Navigation Acts, a series of trade regulations that had been on the books for generations. but had been largely ignored by colonial merchants. The Sugar Act was not a dramatic increase in taxation. It was an attempt to enforce existing laws and raise modest revenue, but it was met with outrage in the colonies. Colonial merchants, many of whom had built their fortunes through smuggling, faced the prospect of criminal prosecution. They had benefited for years from lax enforcement of British trade laws. Now they were being told that the rules would finally apply. This was not taxation without representation. It was enforcement without representation. And the colonists responded with fury. The British Parliament, however, was unmoved. The members of Parliament believed they had the absolute right to legislate for the colonies. The colonists, in their view, were subjects of the Crown. They had no elected representatives in Parliament because they were not entitled to any. Their voices did not matter. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This was the law that would change everything. The Stamp Act required that all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards be printed on paper bearing a stamp purchased from the government. The stamp signified that the tax had been paid. Unlike the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act was a direct tax. It applied to everything from marriage licenses to newspapers to wills. It was visible, intrusive, and deeply resented. But it was not oppressive. The revenue generated by the Stamp Act was relatively modest, around £60,000 per year. The average colonist paid only a few shillings in stamp duties annually. In economic terms, the Stamp Act was barely a burden. So why did the colonists react with such violent outrage? Why did thousands of ordinary Americans take to the streets in protest? The answer lies not in economics, but in principle. The colonists did not object to the size of the tax. They objected to the principle behind it. Parliament had imposed a direct tax on the colonies without their consent. If Parliament could do this, they argued, then there was nothing to stop Parliament from imposing any tax it wished. The Stamp Act was not about money, it was about power. The colonists had spent generations building their own political institutions, elected assemblies, local courts, and town governments. They governed themselves, they paid their own taxes. And now, Parliament was telling them that their institutions were subordinate to the will of London. This was not simply a disagreement over policy. It was a constitutional crisis. The colonists believed they possessed the same rights as Englishmen in England. They believed they could not be taxed without their consent. They believed their own legislatures were the only lawful bodies authorized to impose taxes on them. Parliament disagreed. Parliament believed it had supreme authority over all British subjects, anywhere in the world. It believed the colonists were subject to the laws of Parliament, regardless of their consent. The stage was now set for a conflict that would tear the empire apart. Two fundamentally different visions of government were on a collision course. One side believed in the absolute supremacy of Parliament. The other believed in the inherent rights of Englishmen. Neither side was willing to compromise, and neither side truly understood how much they had to lose. The Stamp Act crisis of 1765 was the moment when the American Revolution truly began. It was not the taxes that drove the colonists to rebellion. It was the principle. For the first time, Parliament had directly taxed the colonies without their consent. And for the first time, the colonists responded not just with protest, but with organized, coordinated, and increasingly radical resistance. The colonial response was swift and devastating. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, crowds took to the streets. They burned effigies of British officials. They attacked the homes of tax collectors. They forced the resignation of those who had agreed to enforce the Stamp Act. Within months, the law was unenforceable. No one in the colonies was willing to sell the stamps. No one was willing to buy them. British officials were powerless to act. In October 1765, representatives from 9 colonies gathered in New York for the Stamp Act Congress. This was an extraordinary moment. Never before had the colonies united in opposition to a British law. The delegates issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which asserted that colonists possessed the same rights as Englishmen, including the right to be taxed only by their own consent. They also stated that Parliament had no authority to impose internal taxes on the colonies. This was not yet a call for independence. The delegates still professed loyalty to the crown. They still acknowledged Parliament's authority over external trade and imperial governance. But they drew a line that they would not allow Parliament to cross. They distinguished between internal taxes, which they rejected, and external taxes, which they were willing to accept as part of imperial regulation. This distinction was the foundation of the colonial constitutional argument. The colonists argued that Parliament could regulate colonial commerce for the benefit of the empire, but they insisted that only their own elected assemblies could levy taxes on them. This was not a rejection of imperial authority. It was an assertion of limited authority. The British government, however, rejected this distinction entirely. In London, the prevailing view was that Parliament had supreme authority over all British subjects everywhere. The principle of parliamentary sovereignty was absolute. There was no room for negotiation. There was no concept of limited authority. Parliament was the supreme legislature of the empire, and its laws applied to all subjects, regardless of where they lived. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but it did not back down on the principle. On the same day it repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. This law stated unequivocally that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonists celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act, but they should have been paying closer attention to the Declaratory Act. The battle over taxation was actually a battle over sovereignty. Who had the ultimate authority to govern the American colonies? Was it Parliament, or was it the colonial assemblies? The British government believed the answer was Parliament. The colonists believed the answer was their own legislatures. Neither side could accept the other's position because both believed they were defending fundamental principles of governance. The crisis did not end with the repeal of the Stamp Act. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. These laws imposed duties on a variety of goods imported into the colonies, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, these were external taxes on imports, and the revenue generated by these duties was intended to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. This was a deliberate strategy to make colonial officials independent of colonial legislatures. The Townshend Acts were a disaster. The colonists responded with a new wave of protests and boycotts. Merchants refused to import British goods. Women organized spinning bees to produce cloth locally. The colonial assemblies issued more declarations denouncing the taxes. Once again, the British government found itself facing a coordinated, colonial-wide resistance. But the resistance was not just about economics. It was also about ideology. In 1767, John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania lawyer, published a series of letters that became known as the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. These letters were read throughout the colonies and transformed the debate. Dickinson argued that the colonists did not owe allegiance to Parliament, but only to the Crown. He argued that the colonial assemblies were independent of Parliament, and that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies under any circumstances. This was a radical argument. It challenged the very foundation of parliamentary sovereignty, and it spread rapidly among the colonists, shaping the political consciousness of a generation. The colonists began to see themselves not as subjects of Parliament, but as loyal subjects of the Crown, with their own independent legislatures. In London, the government became increasingly concerned about the situation in America. British officials feared that the colonies were sliding toward rebellion. The colonists, in turn, feared that the British government was plotting to strip them of their rights and liberties. Each side was convinced that the other was the aggressor. Neither side could see that they were both trapped by their own assumptions. In 1770, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties. The tax on tea was retained, however, as a symbolic assertion of Parliament's right to tax the colonies. The colonists were not satisfied. They saw the tax on tea as a reminder that Parliament still claimed the power to tax them. They continued to boycott British tea. They refused to purchase it, and they began to organize more openly against British authority. The crisis deepened in 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act. The Tea Act was not a new tax. It was a bailout. The British East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and Parliament wanted to help it by granting it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. The colonists saw the Tea Act as a trap. If they purchased the tea, they would be accepting the principle of parliamentary taxation. If they refused, the East India Company would suffer further losses. The colonists chose resistance. In December 1773, a group of men disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 45 tons of tea into the water. This was not a protest against the tax itself. The tax on tea was actually lower than before. It was a protest against the principle that Parliament had the right to impose any tax at all. The Boston Tea Party was the final breaking point. The British government responded with the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston Harbor, dissolved the Massachusetts legislature, and placed the colony under direct British control. The colonists called these laws the Intolerable Acts. They represented a direct assault on colonial self-government. And now, the conflict was no longer about taxation or representation. It was about the very existence of colonial self-government itself. The colonists believed their rights were being destroyed. The British believed they were enforcing the law. Both sides were preparing for war. The American Revolution is often presented as a struggle for liberty and self-government. And indeed, the colonists were fighting for those ideals. But there was another layer beneath the surface. The revolution was also driven by economic interests. Some of the most prominent figures in the Patriot movement had vast personal fortunes at stake, and many of those fortunes depended on something the British Empire was trying to control: land. One of the most underappreciated causes of the American Revolution is the role of land speculation. Wealthy colonists had invested enormous sums in Western lands. They had purchased territory from Native American tribes. They had surveyed the land and planned settlements. They had formed speculative companies with grand names like the Ohio Company and the Transylvania Company. These investments represented a substantial portion of their wealth. The Proclamation of 1763 was a catastrophe for these speculators. It forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. It reserved that land for Native American tribes. And it placed the newly acquired territories under direct British control. The speculators could no longer sell their lands or develop their investments. They had been cut off from their own property. The proclamation was not intended to destroy the speculators. It was intended to maintain peace with the Native Americans and reduce military costs. But the speculators did not see it that way. They saw it as a betrayal. They had fought the French and Indian War to gain access to Western lands. And now, the British government was taking it away from them. George Washington was one of the largest land speculators in the colonies. By 1775, he had acquired over 50,000 acres of land west of the Appalachians. He had invested heavily in these lands and had surveyed them personally. He had carefully planned his future as a wealthy gentleman farmer. The Proclamation of 1763 threatened everything he had built. Benjamin Franklin was also deeply involved in land speculation. He had acquired hundreds of thousands of acres in the Ohio Valley. He was a member of the Ohio Company. He had personally lobbied the British government to grant him land. And he was furious when the proclamation blocked his plans. Other speculators included Robert Morris, who would later finance the Revolution, Patrick Henry, who had invested in Western lands, and dozens of other prominent colonists who had staked their fortunes on expansion. These were not passive investors. They were aggressive, ambitious men who had built their wealth through land speculation. They had much to lose if the proclamation remained in effect. But the economic dimension of the revolution went far beyond land speculation. The colonists were also struggling under British trade regulations. The Navigation Acts, which had been on the books for generations, restricted colonial commerce to benefit British merchants. Colonial goods could only be sold to Britain. Colonial ships could only carry British goods. and colonial merchants were subject to taxes and duties that enriched London at their expense. The colonists had long ignored these regulations. They smuggled goods. They traded with other nations. They built their own merchant fleets. The British government had largely looked the other way. But after 1763, everything changed. The government began enforcing the Navigation Acts. It seized ships. It prosecuted smugglers. It tightened trade restrictions. The era of lax enforcement was over. This enforcement was devastating for many colonial merchants. Their profits plummeted. Their ships were confiscated. They faced the prospect of financial ruin. They were being told that the old rules would now be applied, and they had no representation in the government that was imposing these new burdens. The colonists also resented the restrictions on their ability to manufacture goods. British mercantilism required that the colonies provide raw materials to Britain and purchase finished goods from Britain. The colonists were forbidden from establishing industries that competed with British manufacturing. They could not export certain goods. They could not trade freely with other nations. They were economic subjects, not economic partners. These economic grievances were not widely discussed among the patriots. They did not make for inspiring speeches. They did not rally the masses. Instead, the patriots spoke of liberty and natural rights. They spoke of tyranny and oppression. They spoke of being treated as subjects rather than citizens. But beneath those high-minded principles, there was often a practical economic calculus. Some historians have argued that the revolution was essentially a struggle between colonial elites and British merchants. The elites wanted to break free from Britain so they could control their own economic destiny. They wanted to open new lands for speculation. They wanted to establish new trading relationships. They wanted to create a separate American economy dominated by themselves. Other historians have argued that the economic factors were secondary to the ideological factors. The colonists were genuinely fighting for liberty and self-government. Their economic grievances were real, but they were symptoms of a deeper problem. That problem was the denial of their rights as Englishmen. The economic grievances gave the revolution fuel. The ideological grievances gave it purpose. The truth is that the revolution was driven by both ideology and economics. The colonists believed they were fighting for liberty and self-government. They also believed they were fighting for their fortunes, their property, and their livelihoods. These two motivations were not contradictory. They were two sides of the same coin. The patriots who led the revolution were not all motivated by self-interest. Many of them were sincerely committed to freedom, but they were also aware that British rule was costing them money. They knew that British taxes and regulations were reducing their wealth. They knew that British restrictions on land were destroying their investments. They knew that British enforcement was threatening their businesses. The great irony is that the British government could have avoided the revolution. If Parliament had simply consulted the colonists before passing the Stamp Act, the entire crisis might have been averted. If the British government had respected the colonial assemblies, the revolution might never have happened. If the proclamation of 1763 had been a negotiation rather than a decree, the colonists might have accepted it. But the British government did not negotiate. It did not consult. It did not respect. It issued decrees and expected obedience. And the colonists, who had been governing themselves for generations, refused to obey. The revolution was not simply a struggle for liberty. It was a struggle for control. Control over land, control over commerce, control over the economic future of the colonies. The colonists wanted to decide their own economic destiny. The British government wanted to decide for them. In the end, they could not both have what they wanted. The American Revolution is often remembered as a gentleman's rebellion, a struggle led by educated lawyers, wealthy merchants, and plantation owners like Washington, Jefferson, and Adams. But that image is incomplete. The revolution was also driven from below. Ordinary colonists, artisans, laborers, sailors, and small farmers took to the streets in ways that shocked the colonial elite and changed the course of history. The Stamp Act riots of 1765 were the first major display of popular anger. In Boston, a crowd known as the Sons of Liberty marched through the streets, hanging effigies of the stamp distributor and forcing him to resign. They destroyed his office and looted his home. In New York, crowds burned stamps and attacked British officials. In Rhode Island, mobs destroyed the homes of prominent loyalists. These were not spontaneous outbursts of anger. They were organized and deliberate. The Sons of Liberty were a network of political activists who coordinated protests across the colonies. They recruited sailors, laborers, and artisans to their cause. They used newspapers, pamphlets, and public meetings to spread their message. They created an atmosphere of intimidation that made it impossible for British officials to enforce the law. The colonial elite were initially uneasy about this popular unrest. They wanted to protest Parliament's actions, but they did not want to encourage mob violence. They feared that once the mob was unleashed, it might turn against them as well. But they also realized they could not control the revolution without the support of ordinary people. They had to manage the popular anger without letting it spin out of control. This tension between elite leadership and popular participation became a defining feature of the revolution. The founders wanted a revolution of laws and principles. The mob wanted a revolution of action and vengeance. Sometimes these two visions worked together. Sometimes they were in direct conflict. The Boston Massacre of 1770 was a turning point. British soldiers, stationed in Boston to enforce the Townshend Acts, clashed with a crowd of angry colonists. Shots were fired. 5 colonists were killed. The soldiers were charged with murder, but they were defended by John Adams, a patriot lawyer who believed in the rule of law. Adams argued that the soldiers had acted in self-defense, and they were acquitted. The Boston Massacre became a powerful propaganda tool for the Patriots. Paul Revere created an engraved image of the event that showed British soldiers firing into an unarmed crowd. The image was widely distributed and became one of the most iconic pieces of revolutionary propaganda. The massacre was used to portray the British government as tyrannical and bloodthirsty. But the truth is more complicated. The mob that confronted the soldiers that night was aggressive and hostile. They were throwing snowballs, sticks, and insults. The soldiers were frightened and acting in self-defense. The massacre was not a deliberate act of British brutality. It was a tragic escalation that occurred when the crowd refused to disperse. The revolutionaries knew how to use these events. They understood that the public had to be mobilized if they were to have any chance of defeating the British. They used the press, the pulpit, and the street to spread their message. They created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made it dangerous to support the British. They punished loyalists. They forced people to take sides. They built a movement that would not tolerate dissent. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was another example of the mob's power. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 45 tons of tea into the water. This was not a spontaneous protest. It was carefully organized by the Sons of Liberty. They wanted to send a message. They wanted to demonstrate their willingness to defy British authority. The Tea Party was a turning point. The British government, determined to punish the colonists, passed the Coercive Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor, dissolved the Massachusetts legislature, and placed the colony under direct British control. They also allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, where they would be protected from colonial juries. The colonists called these laws the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were exactly that. They were intended to break the colonists. Instead, they united them. Colonial leaders called for a Continental Congress to coordinate resistance. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances and called for a boycott of British goods. They also pledged to support Massachusetts if the British government attempted to impose direct rule. The Congress was dominated by moderates who still hoped for a peaceful resolution. But the mob was not interested in moderation. In Boston, armed militias formed. In the countryside, farmers stockpiled weapons and ammunition. Rumors spread that the British Army was about to arrest Patriot leaders and confiscate colonial weapons. On April 18, 1775, British troops marched from Boston to Concord, intending to seize colonial weapons. Paul Revere and other writers spread the alarm. The colonial militia, known as the Minutemen, gathered to meet the British. At Lexington, shots were fired. 8 colonists were killed. The British continued to Concord, where they encountered a much larger militia force. The British were forced to retreat, suffering heavy casualties along the way. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the armed conflict. The war for independence had begun. But the Revolution was not just a war against Britain. It was also a civil war. Perhaps as many as 1/3 of the colonists remained loyal to the crown. These loyalists were often harassed, beaten, and driven from their homes. Their property was confiscated. Their families were torn apart. The Revolution was not a unified national uprising. It was a bitter, brutal conflict that divided families and communities. The mob violence continued throughout the war. Loyalists were tarred and feathered. Their houses were burned. They were humiliated and publicly shamed. The revolutionaries used these tactics to intimidate anyone who might support the British. The elite leaders of the revolution were often disturbed by this violence. They wanted a revolution guided by law and reason, but they also needed the mob's energy and commitment. They could not win without the support of ordinary people, and ordinary people demanded a more radical revolution than the elite had envisioned. This is the tension that lay at the heart of the American Revolution. It was not just a struggle between colonists and Britain. It was also a struggle between the colonists themselves, between those who wanted a conservative revolution of laws and those who wanted a radical revolution of action. The mob pushed the revolution forward. The elite tried to control it. In the end, they succeeded, but only after the mob had made it possible. By the spring of 1775, the American colonies were on the brink of war. The British government had sent thousands of troops to Boston. The colonists had formed militias and stockpiled weapons. Both sides were preparing for conflict, but neither side truly believed that war was inevitable. Even after Lexington and Concord, many colonists still hoped for a peaceful resolution. The question was not whether they would fight. The question was whether they would declare independence. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775. The delegates were a mix of moderates and radicals. The moderates, led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They believed that the colonies could secure their rights within the British Empire. The radicals, led by John Adams and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, believed that independence was the only solution. They believed that the British government would never respect colonial rights. The Congress was deeply divided. Some delegates wanted to send a petition to the king asking for redress of grievances. Others wanted to declare independence immediately. The majority fell somewhere in between. They wanted to resist British aggression, but were not yet ready to break away from the empire. In July 1775, the Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition. This was a final appeal to King George III. The petition expressed loyalty to the crown and asked the king to intervene on behalf of the colonies. It was a desperate attempt to avoid war. The king refused to even read it. He issued a proclamation declaring the colonies to be an open rebellion. He ordered his generals to suppress the uprising by force. The king's response was a turning point. It convinced many colonists that reconciliation was impossible. If the king would not even consider their grievances, then they had no choice but to fight. The radicals gained support. The moderates lost influence. The Congress began to prepare for war. In June 1775, the Congress established the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. Washington was a Virginia planter and a former British officer. He had no experience commanding large armies, but he was respected and trusted. He took command of the army outside Boston and began the long process of turning a collection of colonial militias into a professional fighting force. The war itself was brutal. The British Army was the most powerful military force in the world. It was well-trained, well-equipped, and professionally led. The colonial army was poorly trained and poorly supplied. It often lacked food, clothing, and ammunition. Disease and desertion were constant problems. Washington struggled to hold his army together, but the British generals made mistakes. They underestimated the colonists. They believed that the rebellion would collapse if they showed sufficient force. They thought that the colonists were not capable of sustaining a long war. They were wrong. In March 1776, Washington forced the British to evacuate Boston. It was a major victory. The British army retreated to Halifax, Nova Scotia. The colonists were elated. They had defeated the most powerful army in the world. But the victory was not decisive. The British would return. The Continental Congress, meanwhile, continued to debate the question of independence. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a short pamphlet that made a powerful argument for independence. Paine argued that it was absurd for a continent to be ruled by a small island. He argued that the king was a tyrant who had no legitimate authority over the colonists. He argued that independence was the only way to secure liberty and self-government. Common Sense was an immediate sensation. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It transformed public opinion. Before Common Sense, most colonists were still loyal to the crown. Afterward, independence became the dominant view. Paine had succeeded in shifting the debate. He had given the radicals the language they needed to persuade the public. In June 1776, the Congress appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. The committee included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson was chosen to write the document. His draft was reviewed and revised by the committee and by the Congress as a whole. On July 2, 1776, the Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, it adopted the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration listed the colonists' grievances against the king and asserted their right to self-government. It was a revolutionary document. It declared that all men are created equal and that they have certain inalienable rights. It was the foundation of a new nation. But the Declaration was not a declaration of war. The colonists had been fighting the British for over a year. The Declaration was a declaration of the war's purpose. It explained why the colonists were fighting and what they hoped to achieve. It gave the war a moral and political meaning. The Declaration also transformed the Revolution. Before July 1776, the colonists were fighting for their rights within the British Empire. They were fighting to preserve their own institutions. But after the Declaration, they were fighting for something else entirely. They were fighting to create a new nation, based on principles of liberty and self-government. The war continued for another 7 years. It was a grinding, brutal conflict. The British captured New York, Philadelphia, and other cities. The colonists suffered defeats and hardships. Washington's army nearly collapsed on several occasions. But the colonists kept fighting. They were sustained by their belief in their cause. In October 1781, the British army surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia. It was a stunning defeat. The British government, already exhausted by the war, began to seek peace. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The Revolution was over. A new nation had been born. The American Revolution was not one war. It was many wars, fought by many different people for many different reasons. While the Continental Army fought the British, other struggles were unfolding across the colonies. These were struggles over freedom, equality, and the very meaning of the Revolution itself. For some Americans, the Revolution was an opportunity. For others, it was a threat. The most profound contradiction of the Revolution was the institution of slavery. The colonists were fighting for their own freedom, while denying freedom to hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. This was not lost on contemporary observers. The British writer Samuel Johnson famously asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" Slavery was deeply embedded in the colonial economy, particularly in the South. Plantation owners depended on enslaved labor to produce tobacco, rice, and indigo. The wealth of the Southern elite was built on the backs of enslaved people. And yet, the rhetoric of the Revolution was universal. It spoke of natural rights, liberty, and equality. It applied to all men. Some Americans saw the contradiction and tried to address it. In the early years of the Revolution, a number of northern states began to abolish slavery. Vermont abolished slavery in its constitution in 1777. Massachusetts abolished it in 1780. Other northern states passed gradual emancipation laws. The Revolution gave the abolition movement new momentum. But in the South, slavery was strengthened. The Revolution reinforced the economic importance of slavery. The Southern states fought to protect their institutions. The Constitution of the United States, adopted in 1787, did not abolish slavery. It protected it. It gave the Southern states additional representation in Congress for their enslaved populations. The Revolution did not end slavery. It postponed the reckoning. For Native Americans, the Revolution was a catastrophe. The colonists were fighting for the right to expand westward. They wanted access to Native American lands. The British government had tried to protect Native American territory with the Proclamation of 1763. The colonists saw this as a betrayal. They were determined to break through the British restrictions. Many Native American tribes allied with the British. They believed that the British would protect their lands more effectively than the colonists. The Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most powerful Native American political organizations, split over the war. Some tribes fought with the British. Others fought with the colonists. Still others tried to remain neutral. The war was devastating for Native Americans. Both sides attacked Native American villages. Both sides destroyed crops and property. The colonists viewed Native Americans as enemies who had sided with the British. They treated them accordingly. After the war, the colonists did not honor their promises. They pushed Native Americans off their lands. They forced them to move west. The Revolution was also a war of displacement. Tens of thousands of Native Americans were driven from their homes. Their lands were taken. Their cultures were destroyed. The revolution that promised liberty for some meant destruction for others. For African Americans, the revolution offered a chance for freedom. Many enslaved people escaped to British lines when the British Army arrived. The British offered freedom to enslaved people who joined their cause. Thousands of African Americans fled to British protection. They served as soldiers, laborers, and guides. They hoped that the British would give them their freedom. When the war ended, many of these African Americans left with the British. They were resettled in Canada, the Caribbean, and Sierra Leone. The British kept their promise. But the vast majority of African Americans remained enslaved. The revolution did not free them. For women, the revolution brought new roles and new responsibilities. With men away fighting, women managed farms and businesses. They took on work that had previously been reserved for men. They ran plantations, supervised enslaved laborers, and made decisions that had been made by their husbands. The revolution created a space for women to exercise new forms of authority. The concept of Republican motherhood emerged from the revolution. This was the idea that women had a special responsibility to raise virtuous citizens for the new republic. Women were expected to educate their children in the principles of liberty and democracy. Their role was domestic, but it was also political. They were the guardians of the nation's moral health. Some women pushed for more. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John, asking him to remember the ladies when he helped to write the new laws. She warned that if women were not given a voice, they would foment a rebellion. Her husband dismissed her concerns. The revolution did not give women the right to vote or hold office. It did not challenge the basic patriarchal order of society. For loyalists, the revolution was a disaster. The loyalists were colonists who remained loyal to the British Crown. They included wealthy merchants, government officials, Anglican clergy, and many ordinary colonists. They were often persecuted by the revolutionaries. Their property was confiscated. Their families were threatened. They were driven from their homes. Perhaps 1/3 of the colonial population remained loyal to the Crown. Many of them fled to Canada, the Caribbean, and England. They lost everything. They were never compensated for their losses. The revolution created a new nation, but it also created thousands of exiles. For the poor, the revolution was a mixed blessing. The revolutionary rhetoric promised equality and opportunity. The new nation was supposed to be free of the class distinctions that plagued Europe. But the social order did not change dramatically. The wealthy remained wealthy. The powerful remained powerful. The poor remained poor. But the revolution did create new opportunities for ordinary Americans. The western lands opened up for settlement. The economy expanded. New businesses were created. The revolution removed the restrictions imposed by Britain. Americans were free to pursue their own economic destiny. The revolution also transformed American politics. It created a new nation based on Republican principles. It rejected monarchy and aristocracy. It asserted the sovereignty of the people. It created a government of laws, not of men. It established the principle that authority must be based on consent. These were revolutionary changes. They were not achieved immediately, and they were not achieved perfectly, but they set the course for the future. The revolution created a new political order that would eventually expand to include more people. The revolution within the revolution was only beginning. We began this documentary with a question that challenges everything we thought we knew about the American Revolution. The colonists were among the least taxed people in the British Empire. They enjoyed more freedom, greater prosperity, and more self-government than almost any people on Earth. So why did they rebel? The answer is not simple. It is not one cause, but many. It is a web of interconnected factors: financial desperation, constitutional conflict, economic ambition, popular radicalism, imperial arrogance, and a fundamental disagreement over the nature of power. The revolution was not caused by oppressive taxes. The taxes were modest. The Stamp Act raised only £60,000. The Townshend duties were barely more. The Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea. The colonists were not being crushed by British taxation. They were being challenged by British authority. The revolution was caused by a collision between two fundamentally different visions of empire. The British government believed that Parliament had supreme authority over all British subjects, everywhere in the world. The colonists believed that they had the same rights as Englishmen in England, including the right to be taxed only by their own consent. Neither side could accept the other's position because both believed they were defending fundamental principles. The British government was driven by financial desperation. The 7 Years' War had left the empire with a staggering debt of £133 million. Interest on this debt consumed more than half of all government revenue. Britain needed money to defend its newly acquired territories, and it believed the colonists should contribute to their own defense. The colonists, however, saw these taxes as a violation of their rights. They had been governing themselves for generations. They had their own legislatures, their own courts, their own systems of taxation. They had built their own political communities. They believed that Parliament had no right to interfere with their internal affairs. They were not asking for new rights. They were defending their existing rights. The economic dimension of the revolution was also crucial. The colonists wanted access to Western lands for settlement and speculation. They wanted to trade freely with other nations. They wanted to build their own industries and control their own commercial destiny. The British government's attempts to restrict their economic freedom were deeply resented. The Proclamation of 1763, the Navigation Acts, and the enforcement of trade regulations all threatened the economic ambitions of wealthy colonists. The revolution was also driven from below. Ordinary colonists, particularly in the cities, took to the streets in protest. They organized boycotts, staged riots, and intimidated loyalists. The mob pushed the revolution forward, often beyond what the colonial elite had intended. The elite wanted a revolution of laws. The mob wanted a revolution of action. Both were necessary for independence. The revolution was not inevitable. There were many moments when it could have been avoided. The Stamp Act was repealed. The Townshend duties were repealed. The Olive Branch Petition was an offer of compromise, but the British government's rigid adherence to the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, combined with the colonists' equally rigid adherence to their own rights, made conflict increasingly likely. The revolution was also transformed by its own success. The Declaration of Independence was not just a declaration of war. It was a declaration of purpose. It asserted that all men are created equal and that they have certain inalienable rights. These principles would shape the future of the nation. They would be used by abolitionists, women's rights advocates, and civil rights activists. The revolution created a nation that would eventually struggle to live up to its own ideals. But the revolution also had its victims. Native Americans lost their lands. African Americans remained enslaved. Loyalists were driven into exile. Women were denied the vote. The revolution was not a perfect event. It was a human event. It was shaped by the limitations and contradictions of the people who made it. So, the true origin of the American Revolution is not a single event or a single cause. It is a convergence of many factors: financial crisis, constitutional conflict, economic ambition, popular radicalism, and imperial arrogance. The colonists were fighting for their rights, their property, and their future. The British were fighting to preserve their empire and their authority. Neither side could give in, because both believed they were right. In the end, the revolution was a struggle for power. Who would control the American colonies? Would it be the British government, thousands of miles away, making decisions without any regard for the colonists' interests? Or would it be the colonists themselves, governing through their own elected assemblies and shaping their own destiny? The colonists answered that question with blood. They fought the most powerful empire in the world and won. They created a new nation based on principles of liberty and self-government, and they left a legacy that continues to shape the world today. But the revolution is also a reminder that history is never simple. The causes of great events are always complex. The motivations of historical actors are always mixed. The outcomes are always imperfect. The true origin of the American Revolution is not the story you learned in school. It is a story of debt and power, of principle and ambition, of ordinary people and extraordinary events. The revolution was not about taxes. It was about who would decide the future of America. That is the answer. That is the truth that historians have debated for centuries. And now, you know it too.